Before the divorce, Xu Zhi was the admired business wife of everyone in Rongzhou City. It is said that she can only marry a man like Shang Jiming after receiving a fortune from her previous life. After divorce, she sang and played male models in bars night and night, which was called a fancy show. Others say that Xu Zhi was in a daze, so he abandoned Mrs. Shang's position and wanted a divorce. But only she knew for herself how the 2 years of marriage had left her physically and mentally exhausted. Later on, Mr. Shang looked at his ex-wife who was drunk and collapsed in the arms of the male model. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore and stepped forward to snatch her away, feeling aggrieved like a big dog wagging its tail. "Wife, if you've had enough fun, come back and get married." Xu Zhi sneered and pushed away. "Mr. Shang, please take it seriously. We have no problem." Keywords of the novel. Sparkling Red Rose No Pop-Ups, Sparkling Red Rose TXT Complete Collection Download, Sparkling Red Rose Latest Chapter Reading. Chapter 1. Today Wednesday. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Today Wednesday in October, Rongzhou City was supposed to have early autumn weather, but it was unusually hot and dry, with a scorching heat. Even though it was already nightfall, I still couldn't resist the stuffy and hot atmosphere emanating from the air. The iced drink in her hand was just delivered by the waiter, and under the high temperature, the cold air lingered around her scallion white wrist. Where the gaze passes. There are only elevated bridges rendered by neon lights and high-end office buildings towering into the clouds. Not far away, a tall and upright man hurriedly walked out of the office building while protecting a woman. The figure of the bodyguard behind him stirred, blocking most of their figures. Although it was just a hasty glance, the tall and upright figure still deeply imprinted in my mind. My friend came out of the private room and put his hand on her shoulder, saying with a smile, "I haven't seen you for a long time. It turns out you've been hiding here to slack off. Why do you look so absent-minded? What are you looking at?" "It's nothing." Xu Zhi withdrew his gaze, his delicate white fingers repeatedly tapping on the wall of the cup, appearing extremely indifferent. Her pale expression made her friends inexplicably suspicious. But seeing her unwilling to say, it's not easy to ask any more questions. It's already 10 p.m. when I returned to Jinghua Garden. Opening the door and entering the room, the rare light in the living room was on. When Xu Zhi entered the room and saw the man sitting in the living room, he instinctively raised his eyebrows. Seems quite surprised by his appearance. In the living room, Shang Jiming sat alone for an unknown amount of time, holding his chest in both hands, slightly drooping his head, and closing his eyes lightly, as if he had fallen asleep tired. Xu Zhi glanced at him and involuntarily slowed down his steps as he entered the room. Just when passing by the man, the other person opened their eyes immediately. "I'm back." His voice remained cold as ever. Just like him, cold and aloof. Xu Zhi nodded and took off the bag from his shoulder. He casually flicked it onto the single sofa and responded casually, Xu Zhi. Today is Wednesday. Xu Zhi suddenly paused at his feet. Today is Wednesday, which is the day they set aside every week for marital affairs. No wonder Mr. Shang is willing to bow down and come to her shabby house. Shang, as a 3-generation single biography of a merchant, got married at an early age but never made a name for himself. His elders in the family all hoped that they could soon spread the branches and leaves for the merchant. However, when Xu Zhi remembered the scene he saw tonight with someone holding him in an ambiguous embrace, he resisted and lost all interest. Plus, sorry, I'm tired from work today. How about another day? Xu Zhi's words seemed to be just a transaction between them to complete a task, both cold and hard. Faced with Xu Zhi's indifference, Shang Jiming frowned calmly, seemingly dissatisfied with her answer. The man put down the newspaper and stood up in front of her. The man's imposing figure easily obscured most of her sight. Shang Jiming's collar was slightly open, revealing the delicate and enticing collarbone inside. The dim yellow light on his head shone on his shoulder, and his handsome face seemed to carry a bewitching magic under the illumination of the light. With just a glance, it could make people fall into it and cannot extricate themselves. The man approached and hooked onto the woman's slender and soft waist, gently thrusting into his arms. "No, today is your ovulation period, it's just the right time." After Shang finished speaking, he bent down and gently lifted the person around, then embraced them in his arms. In the early hours of the morning, Xu Zhi was extremely tired and had no energy at all, lying soft on the bed surface. She didn't drink much tonight, but her head was still in a mess. I only remember that Shang Jiming's eyes were seductive red from beginning to end. The ultimate temptation. Shang Jiming poured her a cup of warm water as usual. Xu Zhi happened to have a dry mouth and tongue. When he saw the water cup, without saying a word, he took it and put it to his lips. Upon seeing the situation, Shang no doubt turned around and entered the bathroom. Listening to the rustling sound of water coming from the bathroom, Xu Zhi spat all the water in his mouth back into the cup, then got up and got out of bed and poured it into the vase on the dressing table. Unconsciously, he put the water cup back at the head of the bed. After this set of actions, I remained calm and composed without any panic. As soon as she returned to bed and pulled up the blanket, the phone on the bedside table began to vibrate. She instinctively turned her head and saw that Shang Jiming's phone rang. Xu Zhi pursed her lips and instinctively straightened up and reached out to explore. But as she looked at the unmarked phone numbers, she instinctively clenched them. The phone shook for a long time and automatically hung up due to no one answering. Later on, a short message jumped into the screen. She didn't know the unlocking password for the man's phone, but when the message popped up, she still saw some content. "Since it's clear, I'm in pain. Can you come and accompany me?" Xu Zhi doesn't need to look at the following content to know what it is. She quietly put her phone back in place. After taking a shower, Shang came out naked and wrapped a towel around his upper body. The water droplets flowed down his well-textured chest and finally sank into the edge of the towel. Shang Jiming is a very disciplined man who has always had extremely high demands for exercise and diet, so his figure has always been maintained very well. At first, I fell in love with him because of his crazy face and figure. Xu Zhi leaned against the bedside with the blanket in her arms, and only looked up when she heard the commotion. "You have a phone number?" Upon hearing this, Shang Jiming stepped forward and picked up his phone to unlock it. He first glanced at the woman on the bed and then took his phone to the balcony. Ning ning. At the last moment before the balcony glass door was closed, she still heard the man shouting at the person on the phone. Voice, gentle and tender. She has been married to Shang Jiming for over 2 years and has never experienced it before. After finishing the phone call, Shang returned to his room and hurriedly went into the cloakroom to change into his outdoor clothes before leaving. Xu Zhi on the bed finally couldn't resist seeing this and said, "Where are you going?" The man's footsteps didn't stop, and he didn't even give her an extra look. "I'll go out, you should rest early." Listening to his cold and emotionless voice, Xu Zhi suddenly felt a heartache. She tried to persuade him to stay, but when the words reached her mouth, they were swallowed back into her stomach. What's the use of leaving someone behind? After all, it's not like we can't keep their heart. At first, she and Shang Jiming Chunfeng were blocked by media reporters overnight, but later Shang Jiming reluctantly agreed to this marriage. However, this also made Shang Mingming resent him and feel that the accident was a means he used to keep him. Xu Zhi stared at his back, his eyes mixed with complex emotions. Until the sound of the door closing outside, she pulled out her nightgown, put it on her body, and walked out of the balcony barefoot on the ground. The hot and dry evening breeze blowing against his cheeks at night should have felt hot and dry, but at this moment, Xu Zhi felt the coldness on his body. On the small coffee table beside me, there is a hospital medical examination report. She has been married to Shang Jiming for more than 2 years, and the elders of both families hope that they can have children early. Even due to the inability to conceive, her mother-in-law, Ms. Fei, took her to the hospital for a full-body examination, but the results were not satisfactory. Anything that can be detected by just paying a little attention when Shang Ming comes out to answer the phone. But he still hasn't. Xu Zhi picked up the thin piece of paper, didn't even look, kneaded it into a ball and threw it out of the balcony. Out of sight and out of mind, he wouldn't care anyway. After finishing these, she bent down again and reached out to touch the lady's cigarette on the table. With soft and white fingers, he pulled out a cigarette and held it in his mouth. He trembled and lit it. Take a deep breath and then spit out heavily. Between the eyebrows and eyes, there was a worried expression. The phone in hand shook. Unlock, click on message reminder. On the screen, there are several photos of men and women with ambiguous movements and postures. The man in the photo is none other than her husband, Shang Jiming. The cigarette in her hand burned out at some point, burning her fingers and causing her to instinctively let go of the pain. The cigarette butt fell at her feet and almost burned her again. Xu Zhi took a deep breath, his hands tightly clasped against the railing, and his nails sank deeply into the palm of his hand. The pitch-black night was like a black hole, trying to suck her in. Perhaps it's time for my persistence to come to an end. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Contraceptive Pills. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Contraceptive Pills. The next morning, Xu Zhi was awakened by the ringing of her phone. She answered the phone irritably, her voice filled with a violent tone. Who is it? Hello Miss Su, this is the laboratory department of Xingbei Hospital. After identification, it can be determined that the product you sent is a contraceptive ingredient. If you need it, we can provide written materials, mail or self-pickup. Xu Zhi, who was originally still confused, was completely awake when she heard the person on the other end of the phone. Then she recalled the conversation between the doctor and her when she received the medical examination report earlier. Miss Su, your examination report is here. Look, your hormonal imbalance has caused unstable menstrual cycles. Have you taken any medication recently? No, I didn't eat anything, but recently my aunt has become confused for no apparent reason. Looking at your blood test, it seems that there are traces of using contraceptive pills. It is very likely that the stimulation secretion disorder caused by long-term use of contraceptive pills has led to menstrual disorders. How could that be? My husband and I have been actively preparing for pregnancy recently. For a moment, Xu Zhi felt his cold fur all over his body stand erect. An unprecedented cold filled the whole body. Miss Su. Miss Su. Are you listening? The other party saw that Xu Zhi had not responded for a long time, so they couldn't help but shout at her a few more times. The woman was in a daze and said, I'm here. Are you planning to? I'll give you an address later. Could you please help me send it over? Another question is, if I take this contraceptive pill too much, will it harm people's health? Eating too much contraceptive pills will definitely have a certain impact on the human body. Of course, if you are not confident, I suggest you go to the hospital and get a comprehensive medical examination through a specialist account. Xu Zhi said thank you, hung up his phone, and found the address of his studio to send to the laboratory. After putting down the phone, she lay in bed for a long time again. After each end, Shang Jiming would always kindly pour herself a glass of water. A few times, she accidentally discovered that the man had secretly mixed a white powder into the water glass while pouring water. Driven by curiosity, she hid the unfinished water and took it to the laboratory for testing. I didn't expect to get such a result. Xu Zhi has been in love with Shang Jiming for many years, even under various injustices and distrust. She has chosen to marry him without hesitation, but she doesn't want to end up getting such an answer. She couldn't figure out why Shang Mingming was pushing herself to get pregnant while also giving herself birth control pills. Her phone was clearly by her side, and several times she wanted to call the man to ask him the reason for doing so, but reason drove her to stop. Coincidentally, Shang Jiming's phone jumped into the screen first. Xu Zhi adjusted his mindset, picked up the phone and placed it in his ear. With a lazy feeling of just waking up, he muttered to the other end of the phone, "Hello. Just woke up from sleep." The man's cold voice rang from the other end of the phone, instantly awakening people. Xu Zhi pursed his lips and said, Dress up tonight and I'll go pick you up. The old lady has an old friend celebrating her birthday, so let's celebrate on her behalf. Then you need to bring a gift." Upon hearing this, Xu Zhi became quite clear-headed. Although she now harbors resistance and suspicion towards Shang, she remains calm in major matters and knows better where her responsibilities lie as Mrs. Shang. "No need, I have already arranged for someone to prepare it. You can come directly." "Okay." Xu Zhi calmly hung up the phone and continued to lie in bed in the same position without any movement for a long time. At 6:30 p.m., the black Maybach drove out of the traffic and parked steadily at the entrance of Xu Zhi's studio. She approached just as she wanted to open the passenger door, but didn't expect her hand to touch the door handle and the passenger window to be lowered step by step. Song Ning's delicate and charming little face immediately appeared before her eyes. Xu Zhi was stunned for 2 seconds before finally seeing the man in the driver's seat, wearing a black shirt, with his right hand resting on the steering wheel and his left hand casually leaning against the car window. The inadvertently exposed watch on his wrist seemed to unconsciously reveal his identity and status. "Sister Zhi, it's been a long time since we last met on the way. Coincidentally, we were both going to Mrs. Zhou's birthday banquet, so we asked him to give me a lift. I felt a bit uncomfortable, so I took the passenger seat. Do you mind?" Looking at Song Ning's innocent and harmless little face, Xu Zhi thought to himself, "Green tea." At the same time, she didn't forget to cast her gaze at the man in the driver's seat, but unfortunately, Shang not only didn't take her help seriously, but even impatiently urged, "Hurry up and get in the car. The road will be congested soon." Xu Zhi silently clenched her handbag, her nails deeply ingrained in her palm, as if only in this way could she temporarily numb the endless pain in her heart. She gave Song Ning a polite smile and said, "I don't mind." What can she mind? Song Ning is the nominal younger sister of Shang Jiming. Song Ning's father and Shang Jiming's father are close brothers, but they encountered an air disaster more than a decade ago. At that time, Song Ning's mother was also on the plane, and overnight, Song Ning became an orphan. Shang Jiming's mother, Ms. Fei, saw that Song Ning was pitiful and adopted her into her home. Song Ning and Shang are both wise and childhood sweethearts. If it hadn't been for her sideways appearance, I'm afraid the person sitting in Mrs. Shang's seat now would have been Song Ning. Xu Zhi let out a silent sigh in his heart and followed suit as he opened the rear door and got into the car. The woman looked at Shang Jiming in the driver's seat from behind, with an uncontrollable expression of disappointment in her eyes, and turned her head to look out of the car window. At around 6 p.m., it is the peak time for work, and the busy streets are congested with traffic. Song Ning in the front row seemed to have no one to talk to Shang Jiming, but in comparison, Xu Zhi, the hostess, seemed to be just a passing passenger in the car, optional, with no one caring. The woman looked at the constantly receding street view outside the car window and let out a sigh of immense sadness in her heart. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Belongs to me, even with all my efforts, I can't take it away. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 belongs to me, even with all my efforts, I can't take it away. The Zhou family had many guests tonight, with luxury cars gathering outside the main entrance. Shang Jiming parked the car, got off the driver's seat, bypassed the front of the car, and went to the front passenger seat first to open the car door. Upon seeing this, Song Ning's small face immediately lit up with a happy smile and said thank you to the man. Shang, with a clear and composed expression, turned his head to help Xu Zhi open the door, but he didn't expect that he had already opened the door and got off the car himself. Xu Zhi didn't bother his big car and pushed the door to get off on his own. She was wearing a navy blue satin cheongsam today, which matched the necktie of Shang Jiming. The qipao outlined her delicate and graceful figure, with long hair fixed at the back of her head with only a silver hairpin. Her face was like a peach blossom, giving off a feeling of classical beauty. Her every move, every frown, and smile carried a heart-wrenching beauty. Don't be fooled by Xu Zhi's thin and flat appearance, but the area that should be plump is quite substantial. Shang Jiming's gaze swept over her and he furrowed his brow. Xu Zhi met his gaze and instinctively became less confident in his appearance today. What's wrong? It looks ugly, she asked softly. Shang Jiming said, no, but he didn't look away. This man's inexplicable reaction was not once or twice. Beside him, Song Ning saw that he seemed to have been completely ignored for a moment, and reluctantly pursed his lips. He smiled again and affectionately took Shang Jiming's arm. Since it's clear, let's go inside, Sister Zhi. There are many mosquitoes in the garden outside, so we won't get bitten all over in a while. Xu Zhi's calm gaze fell on her hand that was hooked on Shang Jiming, and his gaze flowed calmly, saying, okay. She doesn't want to argue and is too lazy to grab. Since Song Ning returned, she has been intentionally or unintentionally appearing around her life. Although she didn't say anything, Xu Zhi understood in his heart that her goal for returning this time was Shang Jiming. If it were someone else, Xu Zhi would have probably used all his might to drive away the yin around Shang Jiming, as she had done so before. But Song Ning is different. She is different from those fox spirits outside, with a harmless little face that knows how to hide her thoughts. As the adopted daughter of the merchant, even if Xu Zhi is no longer willing to meet her in the old house or outside, they still pretend to be friendly and say hello. Now, she is outside again, even if she is not happy in her heart, she still needs to pretend to be dignified and polite. After all, she is still the young lady of the business, and every move represents the business. If I rashly argue with Song Ning outside, I'm afraid I won't have to wait until tomorrow, and I'll become a laughing stock in the upper class. Song Ning thought that this time he would smoothly hook Shang Jiming and shake off Xu Zhi behind her like before, but he didn't want the man to stand still and not follow her footsteps today. What's wrong? Song Ning tried to take 2 steps and turned around to find that the man was motionless, looking at him with a pure expression on his face. Shang Jiming lowered his gaze and set his gaze on the back of her hand. He then withdrew his arm from her arms, reached out to pull Xu Zhi, who had already walked forward, and brought the person to his side, hanging her hand into his arm. Xu Zhi, who had been walking well before, felt a daze on her face when she was pulled and said, "What are you doing? I should have asked you, why are you walking so fast? Did you see a couple who came to the birthday banquet so separately?" Xu Zhi choked. "I almost blurted out that you still have your sister Ning." Fortunately, she restrained herself as she looked at Shang Jiming's expression. By comparison, Song Ning's face next to him was very ugly, as if he were a pitiful abandoned person. She looked at her empty hands and quietly hid behind her, tightly gripping them. Within the Zhoujia villa, there are magnificent decorations throughout. As soon as you enter the house, you can see many people personally delivering gifts to the old lady, so for a while, many people piled up in front of the old lady. Until the people around him had dispersed, Shang Jiming took Xu Zhi forward. "Isn't this Jiming and Gigi? It's been a long time since we last met. Your grandmother just called me and told me she can't come tonight, so you came on her behalf. Grandma Zhou, you look really energetic today. You look several years younger." Xu Zhi has a sweet mouth, and in just a few words, he praises the old man with a smile on his face. The old lady of the Zhou family is 80 years old, with her gray hair neatly coiled behind her head, and the wrinkles on her face look amiable. The merchant on the side, seeing the situation clearly, took the opportunity to present the gift box that he had been holding in his hand. "Madam, this is a prepared gift. Please don't mind." The butler next to Mrs. Zhou helped take it and then opened it in front of everyone. Inside the gift box lay a small wooden box, with a dark golden logo written with the cursive lawn character. When Mrs. Zhou saw what was inside the box, she immediately looked forward with a smiling gaze. Shang Jiming explained upon seeing the situation, "My old lady knows that you enjoy burning incense, so she specifically asked me to bring you a gift. I hope you accept it with a smile." The old lady of the Zhou family likes to burn incense, and ordinary incense may not even be able to catch her eye. Although this store called Lawn was newly established in the past year or two, the incense sold in their store has been widely praised by some fragrance lovers. Even their incense, once sold, would be completely gone. It's just a small box that the merchant deliberately asked someone to spend a lot of money to grab. When Mrs. Zhou saw this gift, she couldn't help but smile and said, "You guys have a heart. You know, I like this thing, old lady. Ordinary gold and jade things are too tacky, and that's why I like this one." Xu Zhi had no prior knowledge of the gift prepared by Shang Jiming, and only now did she see what was lying inside when the gift box was opened. Later, she didn't say anything to the old lady's gaze last week, but she still wore a calm and appropriate smile on her face. Shang Jiming was hindered by his friends in the mall. Although the protagonist of tonight's banquet is the Zhou family, it does not hinder their exchange of professional experience at all. A temporary stage has been set up next to the lotus pond in the backyard, inviting several famous actors to sing. Now, the performance on stage is Nank Ji. After listening for a few years, Xu Zhi's heart drifted to the distance. This play is really boring. After watching it for a while, in the end, it's just a dream of Zhuangsheng. Xu Zhi has been in a bad mood lately. Seeing this play, she feels even worse. She got up and sat down in a quieter position away from the stage. At this time, the lotus has already withered, and the exposed stamens on the pond have long leaked, leaving behind many dead branches and withered yellow lotus leaves. There are also many koi in the pond, and under the illumination of the lights, each one looks exceptionally plump. Xu Zhi took a handful of fish feed from the servant's hand and playfully sprinkled it into the fish pond. Watching the plump koi rushing towards the pond, Xu Zhi's originally unhappy mood gradually improved, but the good scenery did not last long before someone came to dislike him. When Song Ning came over, Xu Zhi did not notice her immediately. Until someone sat down next to her, she slowly lifted her head. Her beautiful eyes lightly swept over the person next to her, and she withdrew as if nothing had happened. Song Ning also held the fish feed he had brought from the servant in his hand, and generously threw the feed into the water. In an instant, the koi carp that were originally still in front of Xu Zhi swam towards the side, eager to compete, afraid that if they slowed down a step, they would have nothing left. Whether it's for people or things, this little-by-little opportunistic approach is the most useless. It's better to do your best to attract your attention to yourself and get what you want as quickly as possible, don't you think, Sister Zhi? Xu Zhi was too lazy to respond and calmly threw the feed into the pond bit by bit. Although most of the fish in front of her ran to Song Ning's place, there were still 2 or 3 fish willing to stay here for some of her fish food. What belongs to me, even if I put in a lot of effort, I can't take it away. After Xu Zhi finished speaking, he glanced at the person next to him with a hint of meaning. Song Ning smiled lightly and whispered 2 words, "Is that so?" Xu Zhi didn't know what trick she wanted to play, so she stood up on her own, clapped her hands, and planned to leave. However, before she could take her steps, there was a sudden sound of splashing into the water beside her. Puff! Help! Following the woman's cries for help immediately caught the attention of the surrounding guests. End of this chapter. Do you have chapter 4? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Have you ever? The fact that Song Ning fell into the water came as a surprise to Xu Zhi. When Song Ning was rescued from the water, she lay on the ground on the brink of death, her face pale and her body almost trembling into a sieve. Shang Jiming heard the news and rushed over. Without saying a word, he took off his suit and covered Song Ning's body. His big palm pressed against her cold cheeks and forehead, and he nervously pulled her hand to check. That appearance really didn't take Xu Zhi, the merchant lady, seriously at all. "Hey, why did you fall into the pool so well? Hurry up, have someone clean up a guest room and prepare a set of clean clothes for Miss Song." Mrs. Zhou rushed over as soon as she heard the news. After all, it happened in their yard, and as the owner, she should have stepped forward to take responsibility for it. Song Ning choked on several sips of water in the pond, and now her face turned white and her hair turned white. When she saw Shang Jiming, she kept thrusting into his arms, her tears streaming out like broken pearls. Shang didn't immediately take any action upon seeing the situation, but instead pulled up her shoulder and asked coldly, "It's fine, what's going on?" Song Ning first glanced at Shang Jiming, then turned to Xu Zhi. Finally, in front of everyone, she looked at Xu Zhi with teary eyes. "Sister-in-law, why are you pushing me?" After Song Ning finished speaking, she burst into tears as if she had suffered a great injustice. Shang Jiming suddenly frowned, and the people standing around them could clearly feel his cold and thin anger at this moment. Upon hearing this, Xu Zhi furrowed his eyebrows and immediately retorted, "Nonsense, where's the evidence? Just now, there was no one around us, and I can't provide any evidence, but I can't be crazy and so unruly. Let's jump into the water by myself at Grandma Zhou's birthday banquet. Sister-in-law, I know you don't like me, but even if you don't like me anymore, you can't push me into the water. You know I don't know how to swim." In just a few words, Song Ning convinced Xu Zhi to commit this crime, which quickly became a target of public criticism. All the unfriendly gazes were cast at her at the moment. There are doubts, some are shocked, but more of them are still watching movies. The most heart-wrenching thing for Xu Zhi was the gaze from Shang Jiming, who was squatting not far from him. The clear expression in his eyes was that he didn't trust himself. The man's thin lips parted slightly and asked 4 words, "Do you have one?" Xu Zhi clenched his fists tightly at the moment. "No." Upon hearing this, the man's face remained unchanged, still gloomy and terrifying. His appearance is undoubtedly a manifestation of distrust in Xu Zhi's heart. Upon seeing this, Song Ning lightly bit her lower lip and wept as she leaned towards Shang Jiming's embrace. What a pitiful and delicate appearance. Wearing these wet clothes can easily catch a cold. Someone, please take Miss Song to her room to change clothes first. Mrs. Zhou saw the situation and quickly asked someone to lead Song Ning and the others to their room to change clothes. Turning his head, he continued to disperse the onlookers around him and said, "Everyone, the play ahead is not over yet. Let's invite them ahead. If this farce continues, the Zhou family's birthday banquet tonight may also become a laughingstock for others." Mrs. Zhou's actions not only saved her own face, but also gave them a favor as a merchant. After everyone present was taken to the front yard, Mrs. Zhou walked towards Xu Zhi, who was still standing there foolishly, and reached out to hold her hand. "Good child, you're scared." Xu Zhi, who had regained his senses, looked at Mrs. Zhou standing in front of her with slightly red eyes. "Auntie, I'm sorry, it's a great party because of me. How can I blame you for this? If I have to blame you, I can only blame that little fairy for being too capable. I pity you, but I'm afraid this crazy talk will spread everywhere tomorrow." Mrs. Zhou, Ling Mei, and Xu Zhi's mother were good friends when they were young. After their mother passed away, Mrs. Zhou often visited and took care of Xu Zhi. Watching her suffer these grievances today, I feel the same bitterness in my heart. But this is actually their household matter, and as an outsider, it's not better to intervene too much. "Aunt Ling, I'm afraid I won't be able to stay here anymore. Could you please tell Grandma Zhou that I'll go back first and come see her another day?" "Okay, it's getting dark and it's not easy to take a taxi here. I'll find a driver to take you back." "Thank you, Aunt Ling." Xu Zhi dragged her tired body back home when suddenly it rained outside. The pattering sound of the rain made her even more restless. About an hour later, Shang Jiming returned. At that time, Xu Zhi was practicing yoga meditation on the yoga mat in the living room. Shang Jiming was holding his phone all the way and didn't know who he was talking to on the phone. Xu Zhi followed the light music and bent down to lift his hips, without even lifting his eyes. As soon as Shang Jiming entered the room, he saw Xu Zhi with a slender waist and beautiful legs exposed, twisting his body and making various movements. Her body is really soft, especially when it comes to certain things. She always manages to coordinate with herself. The scene in front of me is charming and tempting. Rao, the cold-hearted Shang Ming couldn't help but take a second look. Why did you leave first? Shang asked expressionlessly. He untied his tie and casually threw it onto the sofa, then followed suit and sat down. I was bored waiting, so I left. After Xu Zhi finished speaking, he continued to focus on his own work. It seems that everything around me has nothing to do with myself. Shang was calm and composed, lazily leaning back, leisurely examining the blood-stirring scene before him. Neither of them spoke, and they tacitly avoided mentioning what had just happened at the Zhou family. Until the urgent ringing of their phones interrupted the temporary harmony and beauty between them. Shang Jiming picked up his phone and glanced at the notes on the screen. His gaze instinctively swept over the woman in front of him, but he didn't say anything. He got up with his phone and went outside the backyard. Xu Zhi's originally calm mood drifted away due to the ringing of her phone and the man's meaningful gaze. She gazed at the man's back from afar, her red lips pursed, and for a moment, the mood of exercise had completely dissipated. She secretly stood up and came to the glass door, eavesdropping outside through it. But the sound insulation effect of this door in the house was so good that she couldn't even hear the voice of the man outside. Xu Zhi could only boldly sneak open a little and eavesdrop cautiously. Most of the time, the person on the other end of the phone is speaking, and Shang is clearly listening, occasionally responding with one or two calls. So much so that Xu Zhi eavesdropped on loneliness that he didn't even know who the person on the other end of the phone was. Shang Jiming turned around with his phone and saw Xu Zhi standing inside eavesdropping, his thick ink-like eyes devoid of any unnecessary emotions. He walked straight to the glass door and reached out to open it. Xu Zhi, who was eavesdropping in the room, suddenly leaned forward and hit his head straight into the man's chest. Shang Jiming seemed to have anticipated it earlier, extending his long arm and easily holding onto her slender waist. When the rough and slightly hot palm pressed against her skin, Xu Zhi could clearly feel that piece of skin was slightly hot. I see, Mom. We'll go back after work tomorrow. Rest early. I don't know if it was intentional by the man. When Xu Zhi wanted to get up, the man stubbornly grabbed her waist and refused to let go. The woman was forced to feel helpless and pressed against his chest. As he spoke, the vibration in his chest transmitted to his ears, causing the woman to blush and her ears to turn red. Feeling he is talking to his mother Fei on the phone. She thought this phone call was from Song Ning, a little fairy, and almost rushed out to catch the traitor. Fortunately, I didn't do anything foolish due to momentary impulses, otherwise it would be embarrassing and a big loss. Shang hung up the phone and put it back in her pocket, but the hand that fell on her waist deliberately refused to let go. Xu Zhi struggled a few times, but seeing no effect, he gritted his teeth and simply reached out to twist his waist. However, all the muscles on this man's body were hard, and he had no way to start. He didn't hurt the man, but instead twisted his fingers hard enough. Alright, stop messing around. Shang Jiming. You did it intentionally, let go of me. It's better to be honest and upright. This sentence seems to have stepped on Xu Zhi's tail, making the already restless woman even more rebellious and restless. Yes, I am a villain. I am not bright. Mr. Shang is particularly bright, so let's live in the bright light at home. Since that's the case, let go of me. Don't let me, such a cunning villain, affect your shining and holy saint appearance. Before Xu Zhi could finish speaking, his mouth was fiercely blocked by someone. She looked with her almond eyes open, full of anger. Without hesitation, he opened his mouth and bit back directly. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Shang Jiming, have you ever loved me? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Shang Jiming, have you ever loved me? Xu Zhi didn't know how he got into bed with Shang Jiming. At the end, the man supported himself and fed a cup of warm water to her lips. When the man handed the water glass to her mouth, she instinctively turned her head to resist. I don't drink. Shang Jiming coaxed her with a good voice and anger. But Xu Zhi didn't say anything. Although he was weak all over, his head shook like a tambourine, saying he couldn't feed that glass of water. Shang saw the situation clearly and finally reluctantly put down the water cup. Get up and enter the bathroom, turn on the faucet in the bathtub, and fill it up. Xu Zhi reluctantly opened his eyes to the sound and saw Shang Jiming coming out of the bathroom and walking straight towards him. He lifted the blanket from his body, lifted the person out of the bed, and carried them into the bathroom. After exhaustion, his body was completely soaked in the warm bathtub, and Xu Zhi couldn't help but let out a satisfied sigh of comfort. She squinted her eyes and looked forward. The steaming heat in the bathroom enveloped the man's face, and she lifted her wet hand. The fingertips, still adorned with water droplets, traced along his eyebrow shape, pressed against the center of his brow, then slid down the bridge of his nose, finally resting on his thin lips. How is Song Ning? Xu Zhi didn't know what he was thinking and suddenly mentioned Song Ning. As soon as I thought about how this person had wronged me in front of so many people before, it seemed like a huge stone was pressing down on my chest. Feeling suffocated and uncomfortable. Send it back and have it checked by a doctor. It's not a big deal. Oh. Why push her? Shang's thin lips closed slightly. In the bathroom, which had a charming atmosphere just a moment ago, the surroundings seemed to be covered with a layer of icy frost, and the atmosphere instantly decreased by several degrees. Xu Zhi opened his eyes and gazed at the man in front of him, feeling a mixture of sadness and sorrow in his heart. Shang Jiming, have you ever loved me? Xu Zhi's question left Shang Jiming stunned. You answer my question first, the man asked without answering. Xu Jiang lifted a faint smile on his face and calmly looked at him without saying anything. Apart from the sound of water, there was only the sound of two people breathing in the bathroom. Finally, the woman took a heavy deep breath. It's really asking for trouble. Pushing aside the hand that the man still had on him, he stood up and supported the edge of the bathtub, pulled out the bathrobe from the nearby hanger, draped it over his body, and walked out of the bathroom. The next morning, when Xu Zhi woke up, the bed next to him was already empty. She rubbed her tired eyes, and the signal from her body warned her to indulge in excessive sexual activity. Laid up for a while, got up to wash up, changed clothes, and was about to open the door and go downstairs when I happened to meet Shang Jiming, who had just returned from exercising outside. The two met at the door without saying anything. The man swept past her and walked towards the bathroom. Cold as if two strangers. Xu Zhi turned around and glanced at his back. He reached out and made a gesture of lifting his hand to hit someone out of thin air, then went out and downstairs. Qian's mother had already prepared breakfast. When she saw her go downstairs, she immediately smiled and brought the hot milk to the table. Miss, wake up, the milk has been warmed for you. Qian Ma used to take care of Xu Zhi's mother. Later, after Xu Zhi's mother passed away, she voluntarily stayed behind. Later, when Xu Zhi married Shang Jiming, she also came along. Xu Zhi sat down, picked up a slice of bread and spread his favorite strawberry jam on it. Just as he was about to reach for the milk on the table, Qian Mama brought out the freshly brewed coffee and said with a smile, "Uncle really hurts you. He came to the kitchen early in the morning to warm up the milk for you. It's not until you wake up that the milk temperature is just right." The hand that Xu Zhi had originally reached out to take the milk suddenly stopped in mid-air, and his delicate eyebrows furrowed. He asked Qian Mama with uncertainty. Did Shang Jiming prepare it himself? No, I was startled when I saw him enter the kitchen. Qian Mama's smile grew stronger as she spoke. She had no idea what it felt like for Xu Zhi to be in a tumultuous state of mind at this moment, waves rising higher than waves, almost engulfing her. Qian Mama couldn't help but worry and ask, "Miss, is something wrong?" Xu Zhi silently withdrew his hand and forced a smile, saying, "It's nothing, Qian Mama, go ahead and get busy." Okay. Although Qian Mama felt uneasy, she finally walked into the kitchen step by step, looking at what Xu Zhi didn't want to say. When Shang Jiming changed his clothes and went downstairs, Xu Zhi had already eaten and was almost ready to go out. When the man walked into the restaurant and saw that the glass containing milk was already empty, his furrowed brow immediately relaxed. When Xu Zhi was putting on his shoes on the small chair in the foyer, he clearly felt the man approaching behind him. "What's up?" The woman looked up. Shang Jiming's gaze fell on her lips, which were adorned with lipstick. Her shiny and non-seductive face was truly tempting. "Go back to the old house for dinner at night." "Well, I haven't forgotten," Xu Zhi said without lifting her head as she tied the straps of her thin high heels. "It's nothing, then I'll leave first." Xu Zhi stood up with his shoes on, picked up his shoulder bag, and his beautiful eyes lightly scanned the man in front of him before opening the door and leaving. Shang Jiming stood in place, watching her departing figure. He can't say what's wrong. During this period of time, Xu Zhi felt like she was still and distant. Before this woman, she had a strong love for herself, even willing to deliberately design such a plan to marry her. Is it difficult? Is there someone outside of her? End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Merchant's Old Residence. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Merchant's Old Residence. Xu Zhi didn't know what Shang had in mind and hurriedly drove away. She has a lot of things to do in the morning and has also scheduled 2 guests to meet, so the time is really tight and not enough. The Xu family used to have a background in making incense. Although Xu Zhi's mother and grandfather went early, their studying grandfather left behind many books on fragrance mixing in the research room outside. Xu Zhi had a great interest in this field and learned a lot without a teacher. Even without the financial support at home, Xu Zhi relied on his own incense-making skills and opened his own incense-making studio outside. The incense that comes out of her hands will definitely be sold out once sold, and most of the time it is in short supply. Including the incense that Shang Jiming gave to the old lady of the Zhou family last night, it was also from her hands. The morning work was heavy, and as soon as Xu Zhi entered the studio, he was too busy to touch the ground. Until 4 p.m. in the afternoon, Assistant Xiaozhou delivered the prepared gifts to her office. Xu Zhi then put down his things and sat on the chair, stretching lazily. "Sister Zhi, as per your request, I have bought you all the bird's nest and ginseng. It's about time for you to leave, otherwise there will be traffic congestion again during peak hours." "That's right, I'm leaving now. I'll leave the rest to you." "I'll leave first." Xu Zhi moved his muscles and bones, stood up, carrying gifts in one hand and his own handbag in the other. He walked out of the studio on his slender heels and returned to his old house before the rush hour of work. The merchant's old house is a 2-story courtyard located in the old city area, with a small area. After Mr. Shang left a few years ago, there were only 2 people left in the old house. The old lady and Ms. Fei. When Xu Zhi drove into the parking lot in the front yard, he immediately saw Maybach in the adjacent parking space. It is a car owned by Shang Jiming. "Xu Zhi, stop and get off the car." Arriving at Maybach, I stared at the passenger seat of the car several times before entering the room. When Xu Zhi was changing shoes at the entrance, he heard the voice of Ms. Fei coming from the living room. "Since we're back, it's okay. Let's take a good rest at home and strive to return to the stage as soon as possible." "Thank you, Auntie. However, I have already decided not to return to the theater troupe." This illness and hospitalization have indeed made me think a lot. At my age, I am not young in the dance troupe, and there are many rising stars emerging. I will eventually be eliminated. Don't talk about yourself like that. Auntie is very optimistic about you, but when it comes to age, taking advantage of your return this time, Auntie really needs to help you find a blind date. Speaking of which, Miss Fei couldn't help but sigh. Unfortunately, back then, if it weren't for that kind of thing, maybe you would have known me. Mom, I'm back. Xu Zhi's appearance shattered the peaceful atmosphere in the living room. The originally relaxed atmosphere suddenly cooled down. When Ms. Fei saw Xu Zhi, her expression was flat and there was not much reaction. She nodded in response. The woman turned her head and pretended not to know, looking at the other two people on the sofa with a surprised expression on her face. You're here so early. I thought I was back early enough, but I didn't expect you to be faster. I left work early, Shang said without looking up. He was holding a tablet in his hand, unsure if he was handling work or something, extremely serious. Song Ning next to her saw Xu Zhi with a hint of fear in her eyes, and timidly said, Sister Zhi Zhi. Xu Zhi smiled and cast his gaze towards her. What's wrong? It looks like I'm about to eat you. Just like her, those who didn't know thought Xu Zhi had done something to her. After the woman finished speaking, she smiled and casually placed the gift she brought on the table. Mom, these are birds' nests for you and Grandma, as well as some good healthcare products. I haven't been here for a long time, so I thought I couldn't come empty-handed, so I chose these. Ms. Fei held Song Ning's hand and scanned the table with her eyes. In terms of politeness, Xu Zhi is truly hard to spot any flaws in her. Although Xu Zhi was the first to step forward and say no to Shang Jiming when they were planning to get married. But after spending more than 2 years together, she also knows in her heart that Xu Zhi is not a bad girl, just too fond of his son using the wrong method. And now, the only thing she wants to think about is that Xu Zhi can give birth to a grandson for her as soon as possible, and she doesn't ask for anything else. Even for the sake of giving birth, Ms. Fei personally led Xu Zhi to the hospital for a check. Up some time ago. Although there were no major problems, she still had the doctor prescribe traditional Chinese medicine and instructed the servants at Jinghua Garden to watch Xu Zhi eat Chinese medicine twice a day, hoping that they could give birth early. I still have these things at home. Next time, don't bring so many things. It's a bit heavy to bring them in. Ms. Fei's words were neither salty nor light, as if they were simply asking her not to bring gifts. Xu Zhi remained silent and took off the small shoulder bag. Let me also show filial piety to you. There's no problem with this. Since that's the case, I'll accept your offer. There's one more thing. Last night at the Zhou family, you pushed Ning Ning into the water. Is it the branch that has come? Ms. Fei called Xu Zhi over today mainly for the purpose of last night's incident. But halfway through, the old lady in an apron came out of the kitchen. Mrs. Shang is in her 70s and 60s this year. She has gray hair, but she still looks very tough. She knew that her granddaughter Law was coming today and specially cooked her favorite crispy meat. Ms. Fei advised her for a while in the morning not to work so hard, but the elderly person didn't listen at all. She had no choice but to enter the kitchen. Seeing the old lady coming out, several people stood up one after another from the sofa. Xu Zhi was the first to charge ahead and come to her, directly giving the old man a bear hug. Grandma, don't you miss me? Hey, dirty apron, don't dirty your clothes. It's not a problem. Grandma Shang loves her even more than her own granddaughter. Looking at the entire business, apart from Grandma Shang, I'm afraid there's no other person who can dote on me more than her. Xu Zhi has been busy with work recently and hasn't come back for a long time. It's natural for him to show off when he comes back today. Grandma, what are you busy with? I'll help you. No need, you can sit in the living room with both Ming and your mother. In law for a while, and it will be good soon. Grandma, please let me accompany you. I meet Jiming every day at home, and Mom and Xiaoning are talking. You're alone in the kitchen, so I can help you. Xu Zhi had a sweet mouth and immediately coaxed Grandma Shang into being all sorts of meat and vegetables. She couldn't say a word of rejection for a while, but in the end, she agreed to her request and let her enter the kitchen. In the living room, without Xu Zhi's noisy presence, Ms. Fei once again took Song Ning's hand. Ning Ning, I've wronged you. Don't worry, Auntie won't let your grievances go to waste. I called you over today to ask Xu Zhi to apologize to you. Don't worry, Ong. Auntie, isn't that good? Song Ning immediately looked embarrassed. What's wrong? She did the wrong thing first. Is it a problem to apologize to you? If it's clear, what do you think? Shang Jiming, who was sitting next to him, was suddenly spotted. He put down his tablet and stood up, reaching out to tidy up his shirt. I'll go take a look in the kitchen. The new book is here, little cuties. Remember to bookmark your books. If you have a recommendation ticket, you can also vote for me. Currently, the new book period updates slowly, and most of the time is in the early hours of the evening. You can come and watch it the next morning. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Not So Pretty. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Not so pretty. In the kitchen, Xu Zhi put on the apron handed over by her grandmother. Choose vegetables, wash them, then cut them and set them aside for later use. She also prepared all the onions, ginger, and garlic to put in the nearby vegetable basket. Xu Zhi didn't show any affectation in doing these things, just reached out and did it quickly, which was very pleasing to Mrs. Shang. The elderly like her unaffected temperament. Nowadays, many families spoil their children inappropriately, and if they do something small, they will have to live and die. Just talk about her too. They never go into the kitchen, let alone run into the kitchen like Xu Zhi to help with things. Gigi, I heard from the Zhou family that you were wronged last night. If I tell you something, don't take it to heart. What can he tell from the straight man's eyes? I've heard the Zhou family explain things clearly, and even your Aunt Ling went to find the surveillance records. There's still one on my phone. Whenever your mother helps that little fairy say something at the dinner table, let's turn the surveillance on their face. Don't be afraid, Grandma will definitely stand on your side. Grandma Shang stood in front of the stove wearing an apron, holding the handle of the pot in one hand and a spatula in the other. The sound was transmitted to Xu Zhi's ears along with the roar of the range hood. Xu Zhi, who was standing in front of the sink processing live shrimp, heard her voice and his subordinates suddenly paused. Following an unnoticed sharp shrimp head, it plunged into her finger. Hiss. The intense pain made her throw the struggling live shrimp back into the sink and into a pile of processed shrimp heads. Xu Zhi held his finger and couldn't help but gasp for air. Before she could even take a closer look, a figure had already rushed to her and grabbed her wrist. Shang appeared in front of her wearing only a white shirt. Xu Zhi was stunned before he could see what was happening clearly. He had already grabbed his hand, turned on the faucet, and flushed it clean underwater. Previously, she had been contaminated with the smell of live shrimp, and instinctively did not want Shang Mingming to be infected with it, so she stubbornly wanted to draw her hand. However, the man's strength is so terrifying that no matter how hard she struggles, it is useless. After washing her hands, Shang Jiming was ready to take her outside the house. Upon seeing this, Xu Zhi quickly stopped the person and said, "What else are you doing?" Shang Jiming stared at her and spewed out 2 words expressionlessly from his mouth. "Apply medicine." Upon hearing this, Xu Zhi lifted the hand he had grabbed with a helpless smile and said, "I'm not that pretentious, I just got stabbed, and it's not like I lost a piece of flesh. There's no need to exaggerate." Just as the clear water washed away, the small bloodstains on it had long disappeared, and now even the pricked little eye cannot be found. Shang did not move, but the hand that held her still did not loosen. "Ji, bring this to the dining table, and we'll have shrimp and vegetables to serve. The old lady instructed without looking back. The vinegar meat in the pot has been put into the plate by her, and the small plate next to the plate is used to put seasoning sauce. Here we go. Xu Zhi moved his wrist to signal Shang Jiming to let go. However, this man seemed to have been cursed with a fixed body and remained motionless, making it impossible for Xu Zhi to move. The old lady waited for a while, but couldn't see any movement from Xu Zhi. The old lady looked back with a puzzled sigh, only to see her grandson holding his daughter-in-law's hand tightly without any signs of looseness. She got her hand pricked by a shrimp head. I took her out to take a look. Is it serious or not? Then hurry out and don't stay in the kitchen. Grandma, it's not serious, it's just that I accidentally stabbed it. It's not a big deal. Xu Zhi really didn't want to go out, although the old lady had already given her a reassuring pill. But just now, she also saw Ms. Fei's attitude, which was clearly aimed at seeking justice for Song Ning. She really didn't want to have a conflict with her mother-in-law, so she had to hide. Now that she's gone out, isn't it like falling into a trap? She doesn't want to go out, nor does she want to go out. But the old lady longed for these two people to quickly go out and be alone. Without listening to Xu Zhi's explanation at all, he smiled and waved his hand at the two without hesitation, saying, "Just let Xiao Li come in and help me." The little Li mentioned by the old lady is the housekeeper of the old house, Aunt Li. Xu Zhi's heart was filled with tears. "Grandma, why are you so ungrateful at such a time?" Shang nodded clearly and took off Xu Zhi's apron on his own, taking him out. Before leaving, he paused slightly and turned to look at the old man behind him, saying, "Grandma, you don't need to do these things yourself. There are servants at home." The old lady turned her back to them and said, all right, hurry up and leave. It's not your turn to call me the old lady. You came to take care of my affairs before you even wiped your buttocks clean, humph. Shang Jiming said, Xu Zhi suppressed a smile. Not to mention, the only one in this family who can handle both residential and commercial affairs is probably the old lady. The man, with a gloomy face, grabbed Xu Zhi's shoulder and walked out of the kitchen. Passing through the living room, head straight towards the second floor. Song Ning, who was talking to Ms. Fei, immediately noticed the two people coming out of the kitchen. They opened their mouths but had no time to say anything, and their figures had gradually faded away. Ms. Fei paused in her tone and followed her gaze towards the staircase. Retrieving his gaze, he looked at the girl beside him, pursed his red lips lightly, and then spoke again. Ning, I remember your Uncle Zhou's son is coming back soon this month. You've seen him before, and I remember he's about the same age as our family, but he hasn't gotten married yet. Would you like me to help you act as a matchmaker and formally introduce you two to each other? Auntie, what are you saying? How can this be done? Song Ning's emotional response was so intense that Ms. Fei was surprised and looked at her in surprise. After all, Song Ning has always been a gentle, obedient and charming image in his own eyes. Today's anxious and angry appearance is indeed the first time I have seen it. When she realized it herself, she quickly restrained the emotions on her face and lowered her head pitifully. I just don't want to get married and date at this age yet. Actually, I want to wait for my legs to get better before standing on stage. Getting married too early is not within my plan. Ms. Fei sighed helplessly upon hearing this, but did not speak up. On the second floor, Shang not only brought Xu Zhi into the room, but also left the room on his own to look for the medicine box. Xu Zhi took out his phone from his pocket and opened WeChat. She has been busy all day today and still doesn't have time for WeChat. After quitting work on WeChat and switching to a private account, many messages popped up one after another. Xu Zhi scratched a few times and found Aunt Ling's WeChat. Aunt Ling sent her a video from last night's backyard this morning. Although there is no sound, just looking at the picture is already enough. Xu Zhi immediately sent a thank you reply to Aunt Ling, and then saved the video on her phone. When Shang Jiming returned to the room, she was sitting by the bed with her phone in hand and an unknown smile on her face. She didn't know what she was doing, but when she saw him enter the room, she hurriedly took off her phone. "What did you take?" "A medical kit. I told you I wasn't so sentimental." End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Inducing and Maintaining. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Inducing and Maintaining. Xu Zhi said so, but Shang Jiming didn't listen at all. The man suddenly put down the medicine box in front of her, opened it, and used alcohol to disinfect her fingers. Xu Zhi looked at the man sitting beside him with a serious expression in a daze. For a moment, she hoped that time would stay at that moment. Shang knows that this person is cold-hearted and indifferent, and treats others even more coldly. His appearance today was really beyond Xu Zhi's expectations. Therefore, the woman had to doubt whether he had just heard something at the kitchen door. So he couldn't wait to run to himself and pretend to be a good person, with the aim of preserving his beloved image in front of his grandmother. After Shang Jiming put the iodine back into the medicine box, Xu Zhi withdrew his hand without hesitation. "I didn't say anything bad about Song Ning in front of my grandmother, nor did I mention the two of you. Don't worry, for now, you are still very safe." Shang Mingming frowned upon hearing the words. He doesn't understand what this has to do with Song Ning. Why are they not safe now? Xu Zhi's words seem endless to Shang Jiming. It's really hard to understand for a moment and a half. But he didn't ask much, just frowned throughout, looking very impatient. Xu Zhi looked at his face and lightly rubbed his left finger against his right wrist. That place seemed to still carry the warmth of a man's palm. "Thank you." Xu Zhi murmured softly before getting up and walking towards the outside. At the dinner table, Xu Zhi sat between his grandmother and Shang Jiming, opposite Ms. Fei and Song Ning. At first, the atmosphere on the table was relatively harmonious, and no one mentioned yesterday's events again, as if a tacit understanding had been built up invisibly. The old lady was holding public chopsticks and vigorously picking vegetables from Xu Zhi's bowl. In a moment, her bowl was piled up into a small hill. The feeling of being remembered by others made Xu Zhi's heart soft and confused. But when she regained her senses, her grandmother was picking up a piece of crispy meat and preparing to put it into her bowl. "Grandma, that's enough. I can't eat so much and it will be wasted." "Where are you going? You just eat too little. Look at this wrist, it feels like I can break even one hand." Xu Zhi smiled helplessly. "Grandma, I have gained several pounds recently. I used to weigh only 90 pounds, but now I'm 94 pounds. I think I'm doing well now." "Well, that's great. I like it." Xu Zhi doesn't feel thin. He is 1.65 meters tall and weighs 94 pounds. Say whether you are fat or thin. Although it looks slender, there is meat where it should be, and thin where it should be. Shang is very clear about this point. Just at this moment, he suddenly added this sentence, and the atmosphere inexplicably changed. Xu Zhi glanced in his direction. "I don't want the man's gaze to fall right on me." At the same time, the legs of the suit pants under the table seemed to sweep over her calves, causing a tingling sensation. For eyes facing each other. Xu Zhi's face inexplicably burned. This elder is still here, why is he so bold? Ms. Fei, who was sitting next to her, frowned imperceptibly. "How can you have a baby if you're too thin? The last time I asked someone to send you the Chinese medicine, both of you should drink it on time. It's good for your body's complement. I've already reminded people to keep an eye on you every night and not be lazy. It's important to try to conceive your child as soon as possible." Ms. Fei's tone was unstoppable, and giving birth to a child seemed to have become a heavy responsibility for both of them. When Xu Zhi heard these words, his eyes couldn't help but glance to his side. She is not the sole the final say of childbearing. Moreover, the most important thing is that this man is secretly giving her birth control pills now. The thought of this made Xu Zhi furious. Doesn't he know that taking too much contraceptive pills can harm his health, and it's possible that he might really miss out on her chance to become a mother in the future? The ambiguity that had previously arisen between the two disappeared without a trace in an instant. She lifted her head and looked at Ms. Fei across from her, her eyes slightly drooping and her tone carrying a hint of helplessness. "I know, Mom." At this moment, her appearance fell into Ms. Fei's eyes and she did not win any favor. On the contrary, she deliberately let out a deep sigh and then looked at Shang Jiming. "You know, a few days ago when I was going out, I ran into my old classmates who had already given birth to grandchildren. Every time I went out, I could only lead a dog, and I was almost 30 years old. When your father was your age, I had already given birth to your sister and you. Yeah, my older sister got married earlier than me and hasn't had children yet. Tomorrow, I will also send some of my family's traditional Chinese medicine to their house. Shang Jiming also has an older sister, Shang Jiming, who is 3 years older than him and has already started a family and business, but has not yet given birth." Ms. Fei probably didn't expect Shang Jiming to refute her to the extreme in front of her, and her words were momentarily blocked. That Shang Jiming is just like them. This daughter has married out, whether they have children or not is something that their husband's family has discussed on their own, and she is not qualified to take care of. Kashang is different from Xu Zhi, one is her own son and the other is her daughter. Law. If she lets go, who cares? He compared himself to Shang Jiming and didn't know who he wanted to anger. You. Also, next time I'll ask Jiang Ji to get you 2 Tibetan Mastiffs to raise. Taking them out will definitely be more imposing than your Chihuahua. In the past, it was usually Xu Zhi who faced Ms. Fei's storms alone, but today, Shang Jiming rarely took the initiative to speak up for him. But to be honest, Xu Zhi couldn't be happy. Because she knew that Shang Jiming didn't want to have children with him, that's why he said this. "Okay, I know I can't talk to you, kid. I don't like to talk anymore. Whatever you like, do it." Ms. Fei is both angry and helpless. She really owes him. One day she got high blood pressure, it was all their fault. The old lady interjected at the right moment and said, all right, why bother talking about these things so well? It's better to let some things go naturally, and the relationship between descendants is even stronger. I just hope to be satisfied when I see my great-grandson before I kick my legs and close my eyes. I didn't speak before because the old lady was selfish and stood up for her daughter. Law. But in general, in this situation, she sings with a white face, while Ms. Fei sings with a red face. Speaking too early may hinder Ms. Fei's performance. But as the old lady herself said, she has been sitting here year by year, and she may not be able to wake up one day when she kicks her feet. The only thing I want now is to be satisfied when I see my great-grandson born. But at the same time, she also knows that pushing the children too hard may backfire in the future. Xu Zhi felt a pang of heartache as he listened to his grandmother's helpless and pitiful tone. She lifted her head and sincerely grasped the old lady's hand. "Grandma, please wait. I will definitely fulfill your wish." The old lady's face lit up with joy upon hearing this, and she held Xu Zhi's hand with her back. "Is it possible this year?" Xu Zhi couldn't help but laugh and turned his head to look at Shang Jiming beside him. "When I looked back, there was a touch of pink and shyness on my face. I'm not the only one who can decide this kind of thing. You too, as long as you have this heart, it will definitely work." The atmosphere, which was still solemn the previous second, returned to normal the next second. Because of Xu Zhi's words, everyone at the table had a faint smile on their faces, except for Song Ning sitting there. She seemed like an outsider, silently listening to the family's discussion at the dinner table, and no one noticed the change in her inner emotions. The chopsticks in her hand were tightly grasped by her, while the hand resting on the table clenched its fist tightly. The pain of nails penetrating into her flesh temporarily numbed her restless heart. Looking up, Xu Zhi and Shang were clearly in front of him. So close, that position should have belonged to her. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Idealism. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Idealism. After dinner, the old lady sat for a while and urged the two of them to go back as soon as it was not early. As she was preparing to leave, coincidentally, Song Ning stood up from the sofa and blurted out, "It's already clear." Song Ning's voice is sweet and sweet. It's the kind of sweet girl voice that men immediately like. Everyone's gaze in the living room now fell on her. "Well, I'm going for rehabilitation tomorrow. It may not be convenient to go from my old house. Can I take your car back?" Although Song Ning has been living in a business since her parents passed away, she also left behind a rich family background. The apartment she lives in outside now is the compensation she received after the old house was demolished. Although that house is a certain distance from the city center, it is quite close to the medical center where Song Ning is treating and recovering. After Song Ning finished speaking, she immediately looked at Shang Jiming with anticipation. At the same time, Xu Zhi's gaze also fell on him. She also drove here herself, and even when she went back, they each drove their own cars, which didn't hinder anyone. But she still didn't give up and wanted to stay and see how Shang Jiming would ultimately make a choice. For a moment, everyone's attention in the living room was focused on Shang Jiming alone. He stood at the entrance, with his bent arms draped over his suit jacket, and the other hand holding the car key. His cold gaze swept over Song Ning's body, but eventually stopped at Xu Zhi. Xu Zhi was flustered by his gaze and instinctively set aside his gaze to put on his shoes. Immediately, the man's deep yet magnetic voice came from his side, "Let's go." After speaking, "Take a step out first." Xu Zhi lowered his head, put on his shoes, and took the handbag placed on the entrance. After greeting Ms. Fei to the old lady in the room, she left. All the movements were completed in one go. The smile on his face was flawless from beginning to end, perfect as if he was wearing a mask. Xu Zhi walked straight towards his car after leaving the old house. As they passed by the Maybach car, Shang Jiming and Song Ning stood together, not knowing what they had said. Song Ning's face remained coquettish and shy with a smile. Xu Zhi didn't linger much, not even giving a glance. He walked towards his car, opened the car door, and sat in. Xu Zhi sat in the car with a visibly troubled expression on his face. She fastened her seat belt. With a click of the buckle, the passenger door was almost simultaneously opened from outside. The sudden appearance of Shang Jiming. Xu Zhi maintained the movement of pulling the seatbelt, without any movement for a long time. Shang Jiming got into the car and calmly pulled on his seatbelt. He leaned back towards the seat with a tired expression and closed his eyes. "How could you be here? You shouldn't have." Before Xu Zhi could finish asking, Maybach beside him had already smoothly driven out. Shang neither opened his eyes. "I can't drive after drinking. Let Xiao Yang drive my car to take Ning Ning back first, and then drive back to Jinghua Garden later." Just now at the dinner table, Shang Jiming did indeed sip a glass of fruit wine brewed by Ms. Fei herself, and the alcohol content was no different. There was no fluctuation in Xu Zhi's heart, and even on the surface, he let out a faint sigh. She only thought that he was too concerned about Song Ning, afraid that drinking would cause trouble, so she asked Xiao Yang to send Song Ning back. The woman said nothing and calmly adjusted her seatbelt before starting the car and leaving. There is no air conditioning in the car, and the windows are slightly lowered. The evening breeze carried the coolness of early autumn and blew into the car, driving away the restlessness in my heart. The song "Golden Wind and Jade Dew" is playing on the car stereo. The evening breeze, stirring the strings in the lover's heart, play a song to bring you to my side. This scene is truly a rare match. Xu Zhi listened to the song, followed the melody, and couldn't help but hum a few lines. Her slender fingers landed on the steering wheel, rhythmically tapping the rhythm. Driving, riding in the wind, humming a tune, the person you like is right beside you. Indeed, life is a great beauty. Of course, it would be great if the person you like also likes you. Xu Zhi thought about it and suddenly chuckled to herself. My own idea is somewhat delusional. The woman's smile caused the man next to her who had originally closed his eyes to open his eyes. In his usually calm and composed eyes, at this moment, there was a rare hint of confusion in confusion. What are you laughing at? The man's deep and hoarse voice clearly carried a feeling of just waking up. The male voice suddenly reached Xu Zhi's ears, and she instinctively turned back while waiting for the red light. The disappointment in the bottom of his eyes had not yet been able to be put away, and it was almost imperceptible to Shang Jiming's eyes. The woman quickly withdrew her emotions and responded with a stern voice, "It's nothing." Shang Jiming pursed his thin lips, clearly feeling that she was lying. 1 second ago, she was still humming a small tune comfortably, and the next second, she asked her with a small face. This was clearly the appearance of something going on, not what she said. But Xu Zhi is not very fond of dealing with him now, and he can also simplify his problems. The red light in front turned green, and she stepped on the accelerator again, following the traffic flow smoothly forward. Xu Zhi's driving skills are not at all uncomfortable, even when encountering slightly congested road sections. After resting for a while, Shang Jiming's spirit and energy seemed to have returned, as if he had never seen anything in her car before. The car safely drove back to Jinghua Garden and parked in the garage. I've been tired all day today, and tomorrow is the weekend. Xu Zhi plans to have a good night's sleep. After changing his slippers, he walked to the second floor on his own. But I didn't want to be stopped by a servant who came over with 2 bowls of thick traditional Chinese medicine just 2 steps away. Sir, madam. This is what madam instructed you to prepare before you return. The bowl on the right is for madam, and the bowl on the left is for sir. Miss Fei acted on her own. Just as she heard a hint of relief from Xu Zhi and Shang Jiming at the dinner table, she immediately called and instructed the people in Jinghuayuan to stew the traditional Chinese medicine. When they returned, they would be able to drink it. Xu Zhi looked at the 2 bowls of traditional Chinese medicine still steaming on the tray in front of him, his soft eyebrows furrowed tightly, as if he was about to trap a fly. Let's put it here for now. Let's cool down before I drink. Yes. After placing 2 bowls of traditional Chinese medicine on the living room coffee table, the servant stood up and retreated to the side, but did not immediately leave. It was obvious that she had been instructed by Ms. Fei to stay and watch them drink the medicine in person before completing the task. Xu Zhi frowned heavily and sat down on the sofa. At the same time, she happened to see Qian Mama, who had just come out of the kitchen and nodded at her from a distance. At that moment, Xu Zhi felt relieved and picked up the porcelain bowl on the table, pouring it into her mouth. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Tonics for strengthening the body. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10 Tonics for strengthening the body. Shang Jiming smelled a strong smell of traditional Chinese medicine as soon as he entered the door. Arriving at the living room, Su Jigang put down the empty porcelain bowl with a bitter expression on his face. The bitter taste in her mouth made her almost vomit, with one hand resting on her chest. The painful feeling of wanting to vomit was really terrible. Qian Mama took a box of tangerine peel candy from the kitchen and squatted in front of Xu Zhi. Stuffed the unpackaged candy into her mouth. The sweetness of the candy neutralized the bitterness of the medicine, and Qian Mama gently patted her back with one hand, her face full of heartache. Shang walked forward, smelling the medicinal scent, and his gaze shifted from Xu Zhi's body to another porcelain bowl on the table, which was still steaming hot. What to do? Sir, it was ordered by your wife. From now on, you and your wife should take medication on time before going to bed. They are all good things for strengthening the body and helping with pregnancy. In addition, this bowl is yours, and your wife has already finished drinking it. The man's slightly furrowed brow tightened upon hearing this uncertain question. Have you all drunk? Xu Zhi still covered her chest with one hand, and upon hearing this, she raised her eerie gaze to look at the man beside her. If her gaze could be sharp, she really wished she could hit Shang Jiming a few times. What do you think? You promised Mom, are you still cheating? She feels a strong breath when speaking now, it's really uncomfortable and tight. I'll go upstairs to rest first. After speaking, Xu Zhi stood up and ran up the stairs, carrying his own bag. Shang Jiming looked at her hastily departing figure, then withdrew his gaze and looked back at the dark bowl of traditional Chinese medicine in front of him, which almost completely reflected his appearance. Reaching out for the bowl, he drank it without hesitation. The scorching temperature, combined with a bitter taste, once made his tongue lose its flavor. Ms. Fei, these medicines were specially taken by traditional Chinese medicine practitioners according to their physical condition, and the herbs used were carefully selected and the best, so the efficacy of these medicines goes without saying. Shang Jiming reached out and opened a candy and put it in his mouth. The sour and sweet taste immediately covers the bitterness of traditional Chinese medicine. He could now understand why Su Jigang's gaze at him was so melancholic. If he drinks this traditional Chinese medicine continuously for a period of time, he may also go crazy. The servant cleared the empty dishes on the table and was about to leave, but was stopped by Shang Jiming. Wait a minute. Sir, do you have any further instructions? Take out all the traditional Chinese medicine that my mother brought. Ong. The servant didn't react for a moment. He had finished drinking, could he be prepared to drink another bowl? Even if you are in a hurry to have a child, this medicine is not something you can drink casually. Sir, Madam has explained that this medicine should be taken early or late, and drinking too much is useless. Shang already has a big head. Why is there still something in the morning? Let me get it for you, just take it out directly. Oh, good. The servant looked at his gloomy expression and didn't dare to say much for a moment. He quickly turned around and took the remaining few bags. Xu Zhi took a shower, dried her hair, and brushed her teeth before coming out of the bathroom. The temperature in the room was moderate, and she came out wearing a silk nightgown with a suspender. Her long curly hair was soft and draped over her shoulders. At that time, Shang Zhenghao had just entered from outside, and their eyes met for a moment. Xu Zhi calmly wiped away the body milk on his arms, walked over to the bedside, and then spread the excess body milk from his hands onto his two thin and white calves. The sober aroma of green tea mixed with the fragrance of shower gel permeated the room. Xu Zhi himself is a seasoner, so he is particularly sensitive to aroma. Knowing what kind of flavor, fragrant but not greasy, yet able to captivate people invisibly. At the moment Shang Jiming stepped into the room, his gaze seemed to be glued onto her, unable to move away for a long time. Although the air conditioning was on in the room, he inexplicably felt as if his body was gradually getting hot and dry. In addition, the elusive aroma occasionally lingered at the tip of his nose, as if urging him to quickly approach her. Shang Jiming reached out his hand, his long fingers with distinct joints resting on the necktie. With a slight force, he pulled it loose. Taking advantage of the situation, one hand untied the two buttons on the collar. The cold eyebrows and eyes seemed to have been tinged with a hint of red. When Xu Zhi lifted his head, the man had already stood in front of him. The large lights above his head were all covered by his figure, and when Xu Zhi was about to retreat, he didn't want him to suddenly move with his movements. She took a step to the left, and he followed suit. She took 2 steps to the right, and he followed suit. She almost stood in her way without leaving a single step. At present, Xu Zhi raised his head and threw a puzzled look at him. What are you doing? Let me get my phone. That medicine is a bit off. What? Shang Jiming's voice was very soft, and Xu Zhi couldn't hear it clearly for a while. The overhead light suddenly dimmed with a snap. Along with it, the light outside the villa seemed to have completely extinguished in an instant. Power outage. Xu Zhi glanced at the Chaoyang terrace and a tall figure suddenly overturned towards her. Hey! What are you doing? What do you say? You also drank the medicine. A muffled voice, with a hint of grievance hidden in its tone. Through the thin shirt, the scorching temperature under the palm of my hand. Shang Jiming buried his head in her neck socket. The warm breath sprayed all over her skin. Stir up waves and tremble. Xu Zhi listened to his voice and his eyes trembled lightly. You, go take a shower first, he said, I'll wash it later. Shang Jiming is like a big mountain, which makes her feel a bit suffocated. Smelling the faint aroma on her body, mixed with the medicinal properties in her body, it completely erupted. When the electricity came, the sudden light stabbed Xu Zhi and he couldn't open his eyes for a moment. In a faint moment, she seemed to see Shang Jiming's handsome face close at hand, even the small mole at the end of her eyes clearly visible. Xu Zhi raised his hand and caressed the face. This man, this face, at least at this moment, belongs to her alone. Since it's clear, let's have a child, she said in a soft voice. Focus. Shang not only did not directly answer her question, but also deliberately acted mischievously. At the last moment when his consciousness was completely shattered, Xu Zhi still held his breath in his heart, looked at his shoulder position accurately, and opened his mouth without hesitation, biting down heavily. End of this chapter.